for Lou.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that warm welcome. If you can't hear me, just there is a mic which I can use, but we won't use it unless it's necessary. I'll start by thanking Meta for organizing this series and Barbara for inviting me and hosting me. I bring greetings from the nation's capital, which chances are you're hearing all too much about these days. So I'll move on to the topic at hand. It's been a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to look more closely at what's been happening in the Marshall Islands, to look at their history, their people, the nuclear testing by the US and that legacy, and then the lawsuits that the Marshall Islands have launched at the International Court of Justice. I'm not an expert, but I'm an activist. And as I say, this has been a very pleasing opportunity to get to know a bit more about what the story is around the Marshall Islands and this initiative. So I hope during the question and answer period I'd be interested in your comments and would try to answer any questions that you might have. So start first with a brief history and geography. Marshall Islands are composed of 1,200 islands that are two chains of coral atolls in the South Pacific, about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. An atoll is a coral reef or string of coral islands that surrounds a lagoon. The first Micronesian navigators arrived in the Marshall Islands several thousand years ago. They were skilled navigators and made long voyages between the islands by canoe. In the 1600s, Spain laid claim to the islands. In the late 1700s, they acquired their name from a British naval captain named John Marshall, who was sailing through the area with convicts on his way to Australia. In the late 1800s, Germany annexed them and paid Spain some kind of compensation. In 1914, Japan captured them. And in 1944, the US captured them, the Marshall Islands, from the Japanese. In 1947, Marshall Islands became a trust territory of the Pacific Islands. It was created by the United Nations and administered by the US. So these islands have been traded around from colonial power to colonial power over the last several hundred years, while the indigenous peoples of the Marshall Islands, Micronesians, have lived there for thousands of years. The concept of terra nullius, a Latin term, was just applied to the Marshall Islands. It describes a territory that nobody owns, and that the First Nation to discover it is therefore entitled to take it over, a sort of finders keepers approach. It means devoid of human beings, a category applied by Roman lawyers to enemy lands and places such as desert islands. The term terra nullius has justified the dehumanization of indigenous peoples for centuries in different areas of the colonized world, including Canada. But we know the islands were not empty, and they were not discovered by colonizers. The Marshall Islands have also had their share of missionaries over the centuries, and frequently the term savage or primitive human being was applied to the indigenous peoples living there. The Marshall Islands is part of the Pacific indigenous peoples, so that whole region, were colonized relatively late in the game in global terms by Europeans. But unlike some of the other small islands in the South Pacific, they have the Marshall Islands has remained a self-governing state, but in relationship in free association with one of its former colonizers, the United States. So under this free association, the United States has the full authority and responsibility for security and defense of the Marshall Islands. And the government of the Marshall Islands is, quote, obligated to refrain from taking actions that would be incompatible with these security and defense responsibilities of the U.S. So given the history and geography of the Marshall Islands, it's fairly obvious why the United States chose to use that area as its nuclear testing area. So the Marshall Islands currently has a population of about 70,000 people. So 70,000, it's pretty small. They are a constitutional republic led by a president who was elected in early 2012. They have one legislative house, and they also have an indigenous council, Council of Chiefs, which is serves in an advisory capacity concerned with traditional laws and customs in the area. And interestingly, some 12,000 Marshallese live in the United States, mostly in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. So many of them left the island to move to the United States for employment, for educational opportunities, to get away from the lingering effects of the nuclear testing, and also the consequences of the sea level rising in the islands. They hold a nuclear Remembrance Day in 2014 to reflect on the nuclear legacy, honor the survivors and victims of the testing, and to educate the public about the global consequences of nuclear weapons. The Republic of the Marshall Islands' main sources of revenue are substantial U.S. subsidies under this Compact of Free Association, and also the U.S. leases land for a missile testing range in Kwajalein, which is in the middle there. So there's the Ronald Reagan missile testing site is there. Most of the population in the Marshall Islands lives on Kwajalein or in the capital of Majuro, and about 25% of the population live on some of the surrounding islands, on the outer islands, dependent on subsistence farming and fishing. So the Marshall Islanders still practice their indigenous practice of fishing and farming, and they also practice indigenous laws and customs that they've had through the centuries. It is noteworthy to notice how tied the Marshall Islands are to the United States economically, at the same time as they struggle with the legacy of the U.S. testing program and the outright violation of human rights. So the lawsuits, these are the 9 countries that are armed with nuclear weapons. In April of 2014, so a little more than a year ago, the Marshall Islands filed an application at the International Court of Justice to hold these 9 countries accountable for, 1, the violation of international law with respect to their nuclear disarmament obligations under the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and 2, under customary law. Together, these 9 countries hold about 16,000 nuclear weapons between them. For nearly half a century, since the NPT, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, came into force in 1970, no other nation or organization has sued for the enforcement of the NPT, which has been ignored by the nations that possess and continue to upgrade their nuclear arsenals. The U.S. routinely invests tens of billions of dollars annually into their nuclear weapons. The NPT, for all practical purposes, does not exist for these 9 countries. The lawsuits are founded on the unanimous conclusion of the International Court of Justice in 1996, the advisory opinion that came from the court that says that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. So what the Marshall Islands are seeking through the court is a declaratory judgment by the court of a breach of obligations related to nuclear disarmament, and an order from the court to take, for these countries to take within 1 year of the judgment all steps necessary to comply with those obligations. This is a bit legalistic, but it includes the pursuit also of negotiations aimed at the conclusion of a convention on nuclear disarmament in all its aspects. So basically, they're demanding, the Marshall Islands are demanding through the ICJ for these countries to show, to get on with nuclear disarmament and to show some concrete action toward the negotiation and conclusion of a nuclear weapons convention. They're not seeking financial compensation. If the cases are successful, the court's judgment will be binding. And while a judgment is formally binding only to the parties of the cases, which would be these ones, it also would apply, could be interpreted as applying to other states as well. And this decision of the court would be different than the advisory opinion too, which was an advisory opinion, and this would actually be an order from the court. It would be a decision by the court. So the 5 countries on the left in orange are all signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the 4 here in blue, India, Israel, North Korea, and Pakistan, have not signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we have those 2 categories. And then a third category, which overlaps them, is the 3 countries, the UK, India, and Pakistan, recognize the ICJ. They recognize the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. So those 3 countries which accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the court, those cases are underway. There have been hearings on the preliminary issues to decide whether the cases are suitable for the court to hear, and some of the documentation necessary for those cases has been filed. It will be several years before these cases make their way through the courts. It's very slow. There's a lot of legal back and forth. But for these 3 countries that recognize the ICJ, things are underway. For the other 6 countries that don't recognize the ICJ, the Marshall Islands is calling on them to accept the jurisdiction of the court. So it's invited them to accept the jurisdiction of the court and then to explain to the court what their positions are related to nuclear disarmament. So the basis of the lawsuits are the Non-Proliferation Treaty and customary international law. For the 5 NPT signatories, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, their obligations to disarm under the NPT as well as under customary law. So the Marshall Islands argue that these 5 countries are not currently meeting their obligations under Article 6 of the treaty to negotiate in good faith for complete nuclear disarmament. Under customary international law, which would cover the states not signatory of the NPT as well as the ones that are signatory, the customary obligations are based on widespread and representative participation of the states in the NPT and the long history of the United States resolution on nuclear disarmament, as well as the incompatibility of nuclear weapons to international law in terms of the proportionality and the indiscriminate nature of nuclear weapons. So the Marshall Islands argue that the 4 nuclear armed countries that are not part of the NPT, even though they're not part of the NPT, they have the same obligations under customary law, because there are these other circumstances which all speak to the illegality of nuclear weapons. These cases that the Marshall Islands are going forward with mark the first time that the ICJ has been asked to address issues related to nuclear weapons since 1996. And if they do proceed, the lawsuits, they will result in a decision, as I said, which is unlike the one for the advisory opinion. And the decision that would come out from the courts could be enforced by the Security Council. Unlikely, but it could be enforced. The decision could be enforced. So far, none of these other 6 countries, which are not do not recognize the ICJ, have accepted the invitation to come in under the jurisdiction of the ICJ. China notified the court that it declines to accept the court's jurisdiction, and Russia has said that the lawsuit is baseless and would not help to get rid of nuclear weapons in the world today. So the 3 countries where there is some action happening and relate to the ICJ, which we have a picture here in The Hague. The UK has the case against the United. So there's each of these 9 countries. It's a separate lawsuit that's been filed. So in the case against the UK, it addresses the question of whether the UK's opposition to the UN General Assembly resolutions calling for the start of multilateral negotiations on a treaty, and among other foot-dragging display of inaction by the United Kingdom, whether that is a violation of their obligation to pursue negotiation for nuclear disarmament. So the Marshall Islands has a deadline of October the 15th to file its statement on the preliminary objections that the United Kingdom has raised against the case. In terms of India and Pakistan, the Marshall Islands hold that they are also bound by customary obligations arising out of the NPT, because, as you know, the NPT has 191 signatories to it, so there is a body of adherence in the global community to the NPT. The framing of the nuclear disarmament obligation in the from the 1996 opinion and the court's underlying analysis suggests that they are customary law, but the court will consider whether customary law would apply in this case. So thanks to Google Alert, which is an amazing, if you ever want to sort of keep on top of something that's happening, I learned that last week India has filed its rebuttal to the Marshall Islands before to file it with the International Court of Justice, after initially arguing that the court had no jurisdiction on this dispute. So they changed their mind, and their rebuttal, apparently, although it's not made public, gives some detail of India's quantitative buildup and qualitative improvement of nuclear force based on open source material. So although their rebuttal is not public, it's speculated that they're basing their argument on some reservations they made in 1974, which, as you may recall, was when they tested a nuclear weapon for the first time. And at that time they declared that the ICJ cannot adjudicate on disputes concerning multilateral treaties like the NPT. And furthermore, India argues self-defense for the need to strengthen their nuclear weapons for self-defense, because they have outlined in 1974 certain types of disputes for which they would not accept the ICJ's opinion. And Pakistan is deadline for for filing its counter memorial is the 1st of December, so their rebuttal is still to come. In addition to these cases against the nuclear 9 countries, the Marshall Islands also filed a companion case in the United States against in the U.S. federal court in San Francisco at the same time as they filed at the ICJ. This case was dismissed some months ago, saying that that the speculative fear of the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons that's outlined in their lawsuit, and that it's too speculative, the fear of the possible use of nuclear weapons, and also that the plaintiff fails to allege a concrete harm that's unique to them. So the Marshall Islands in their case said that it's all of humankind that would be affected by nuclear weapon going off. So the court, for some strange logic, said that the plaintiff, the Marshall Islands, fails to allege a concrete harm unique to them. So for some reason, this this gave them cause to dismiss the cases. So I found that the IPPNW, which is the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, of which the Physicians for Global Survival is the Canadian affiliate, IPPNW and the American affiliate, PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and Pax Christi, they filed a friend of the court document in the U.S. court explaining why there is a real fear. It's not just a fear of the possibility, a vague fear of the possibility of the nuclear detonation, but citing a number of near accidents, either intentional, possible intentional use or near accidents. A very comprehensive document that has been filed. So the case was dismissed, but they are appealing it. So again, it's probably a long process, but to anybody who cares about nuclear weapons and follows the discussion at all, gets the sense that this is ridiculous, that they dismissed it based on those grounds. The international diplomatic and political face of the lawsuits for the Marshall Islands is their foreign minister, Tony DeBruym, who was 9 years old at the time of the detonation of Castle Bravo test in 1954. He was fishing with his grandfather, so it made such an impression on him, and then through the years he has been a tireless advocate for nuclear disarmament and has taken the Marshall Islands to this stage where they now have filed with the ICJ. So a little bit about the testing. The story and legacy of the U.S. testing in the Marshall Islands is hard to capture in words, actually. The more you read about it, the more unbelievable and shocking it becomes. Among other things, there's a blatant disregard for the rights of the indigenous people of the Marshall Islands. There was no effort to effectively accommodate their safety, their rights, their concerns, or their needs. There was no consultation, no what we have come to know now as free, prior, and informed consent. The islanders were duped into believing that they were making a contribution to the well-being of mankind or humankind. They were dislocated and relocated from island to island over the course of the testing, and many still remain internally displaced in the country. As Tony DeBruym, Foreign Minister, has said, the people of the Marshall Islands had their homeland, culture, and health sacrificed so that the United States could amass a nuclear arsenal. Between 1946 and 1958, The islands of the atolls of Bikini and Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands were the main sites where the U.S. carried out 67 above-ground nuclear weapons tests, an explosive yield equivalent to 1.6 Hiroshima bombs detonated every single day over the course of 12 years. So you can see where the two red X's are, up in the top left, Eniwetok and Bikini, where most of the testings were done. And then just moving to the right, Rongelap, the sort of blue circular for Rongelap, and Ultarik. Those were also affected by downwind from the explosions, particularly from Bravo, which we'll talk about in a minute. The populations of Bikini and Eniwetok were relocated to other atolls before the testing began. So these are some children in 1946 who were being moved from Bikini. So Bikini is the name of the atoll, which is a ring of 23 coral islands around a lagoon. In 1946, it became the site for the first nuclear weapon tests following the Second World War. And that was because it offered the most remote location with a large protected anchorage, suitable but not ideal weather, and a small, easily moved population. It apparently was chosen over the Galapagos.
Oh my goodness.
So 167 Bikini Islanders were moved by the U.S. Army to Rongelap Atoll, which is 125 miles to the east. After the displacement of the population, 23 tests were carried out on Bikini from 46 to 58. And it played a very significant role in the U.S. nuclear testing in what they called the proving grounds. The first tests conducted in 1946 were called Operation Crossroads. This cake apparently is an angel food cake made in the form of a mushroom-shaped cloud. The man on the left is the Joint Army-Navy Task Force, head of the Army-Navy Task Force, Vice Admiral William H.P. Blandy, and his wife, and Rear Admiral somebody on the right. So this was, Operation Crossroads was the first set of the tests, and it was significant in the U.S. history. This, you can't really read the islands, but it gives you a sense of how much the people were moved around from one island to another. They were moved and then moved again and then moved again.
All of them? All of them?
Pardon?
All of them?
Not all of them. Ones that were on particular, so that Bikini is up in the left. Eniwetok over on the far right is the other site of the testing. And so people were moved back and forth there. Some to Kwajalein, this is where the U.S. testing is, right? The missile testing site is. Bikini Islanders were moved around shamelessly, like pawns, like expendables, like inconvenient islanders. In 1948, they were moved to Kili after spending 2 years on Rongelap because they were starving. Some were resettled back to their atoll in 1969. More than 100 people were moved back to Bikini after the U.S. declared the island to be radiologically safe. But then were evacuated again in 1978 after radiation exposures were found to be excessively large because the U.S. government had failed to take into account the uptake of contamination from the local food supply. So having ingested unacceptably high levels of cesium-137 and strontium-90, they were evacuated again. The coconuts on the Bikini are still radioactive because the coconut tree, the palm tree, concentrates the absorbed cesium-137 and other radioactive elements from the soil and concentrates them into the coconut. So the Bikini Islanders actually remain scattered over a number of islands. In August of this year, the Bikini Council, located on the islands of Kili, which is this one down here, they voted to return home, to use the resettlement trust fund that exists for the Bikini Islanders, established by Washington. But it's most of the islanders want to move actually to the United States, but the trust fund is only for internal movement of the islanders, not for moving them outside of the Marshall Islands to the United States. So there's some very strict limits to what the trust fund can do. And added to the problem of subsistence on the Marshall Islands is the impact of the rising sea levels on the islands of Kili and Egypt, which are also home to people who have been relocated from the Bikini Atoll, which have been covered by high waves at least 5 times in the last 4 years, resulting in contamination of all the wells on both islands. The Bikini Atoll, at the request of the Marshall Islands, was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010. And part of the citation reads, Bikini Atoll has conserved direct, tangible evidence that is highly significant in conveying the power of the nuclear tests. The sunken ships sent to the bottom of the lagoon by the tests in 1946 and the gigantic Bravo equator, equivalent to 7,000 times the force of the Hiroshima bomb. The tests had major consequences on the geology and natural environment of Bikini Atoll and on the health of those who were exposed to the radiation. The atoll symbolizes the dawn of the nuclear age, despite its paradoxical image of peace and earthly paradise. This picture you've likely seen before. It's the explosion of the Bravo test, which was a 15 megaton bomb, a thermonuclear bomb, detonated on the 1st of March in 1954. It was the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated by the United States. The wind changed direction several hours before the detonation, unexpectedly. These things happen. And the fallout was unexpectedly deposited on some of the surrounding atolls. So you can see in Bikini and Alinganai Atoll, Rongelap, and Rongerik. So the immediate fallout was over these 2 other islands, and then a larger area that was affected by the fallout. The fallout caused contamination over an area of 11,000 square kilometers, spreading traces of radioactive material as far as Australia, India, Japan, the US, and parts of Europe. The fallout consisted of coral rock, soil, and other debris sucked up in the fireball and made intensely radioactive by the nuclear reaction. A few hours after the explosion, fallout from the explosions came down, sprinkling over a Japanese fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon No. 5, which had strayed into the area. The boat was some 145 kilometers downwind of the explosion at the time. Many of the Lucky Dragon's crew became ill, and one of the crew members died. And here you can see in the market in Tokyo, the tuna catch that the Lucky Dragon brought in was being tested for radioactivity. The United States had apparently several months before the detonation of Bravo told the Japanese the area that would be affected, but the crew of the Lucky Dragon were not aware of that. Marshall Islander Lijan Eknelang was living on the Rongelap Atoll, which was one of the islands affected by the fallout. It's about 170 kilometers downwind from Bikini, and it was showered with radioactive particles. And she gave a testimony before the International Court of Justice in 1996, and is written similarly in this book called The Pacific Women Speak Out. So she describes the morning of the explosion on March the 1st. The day of the Bravo test, there was a huge, brilliant light that consumed the sky. We all ran outside our homes to see it. The elders said another world war had begun. I remember crying. I did not realize at the time that it was the people of Rongelap who had begun a lifelong battle for their health and a safe environment. Not long after the light from Bravo, it began to snow on Rongelap. We had heard about snow from the missionaries and other Westerners who had come to our islands, but this was the first time that we had seen white particles fall from the sky and cover our village. Of course, in 1954, Marshallese children and their parents did not know that the snow was radioactive fallout from the Bravo test. They were evacuated more than 2 days after the detonation. So they spent 2 days and some in the midst of the fallout. In her testimony at the ICJ, Lijan goes on to describe the reproductive health impact on the women of Rongelap, and the islanders called jelly babies, which were born to many of the women after the testing. She herself died in 2012 at the age of 66. After the testing ended in 1958, the Marshall Islanders was a trust territory of the United States. It was left with obliterated islands, huge craters, and widespread radiological contamination. Irradiated debris blanketed the islands, leaving plutonium-239, the fissile isotope used in nuclear warheads, which has a half-life of 24,000 years. So while Bikini was so radioactive that there was little hope of allowing its displaced population ever to return home, on the other island of Eniwetok, the military studied how they could clean it up. So Eniwetok is a large coral atoll which has about 40 islands that make it up. So they wanted to recoup some of the land, some of the area, so it could become habitable again. And the U.S. Defense Department concluded that there was so much soil contaminated with cesium-137 and strontium-90 that the safest approach was to leave it alone and to let it decay naturally. Both of those have half-lives of about 30 years. However, also left behind were the blasts with plutonium-239, which has a half-life of 29,000 years. So what to do? What do you think they did?
They let them move back.
They buried it.
Oh.
If in doubt, bury. So in the late 1970s, the U.S. Defense Nuclear Agency dumped as much plutonium contaminated soil as they could gather into a 33-foot deep crater on the tiny island of Runit, which is part of the Eniwetok Atoll. The crater had been carved out by a 1958 bomb, roughly the size of the one detonated over Hiroshima. Then a concrete dome was built over top of all this radioactive material. In addition to the contaminated soil that they shoveled in, the crews collected some 437 plastic bags with plutonium chunks that they picked up from the ground, leaving that were left behind but when one bomb had misfired. All these went into the crater, and then they put an 18-inch thick concrete cap on it. Most of the radioactive waste, with too little plutonium to trouble with, was bulldozed into the lagoon over the objections of the Environmental Protection Agency and, of course, the displaced people of Eniwetok. American officials also chose to leave radiation on the land at levels that were far higher than would have been allowed in a similar cleanup in the United States. The cleanup was completed in 1980, and some of the residents of Eniwetok, who had been forced out in 1946, were allowed to return. About half the atoll remains uninhabitable, however, and most of the rest has lost its ability to grow food. And in one article I read said that canned Spam has become a staple. So longevity was not one of the design criteria in the Runit Dome. And in fact, the dome doesn't even meet American standards for landfills for household trash, apparently. A task force of the US government's National Research Council warned in 1982 that the dome might be breached by a severe typhoon. Then a 2013 report sponsored by the Department of Energy saw no reason to worry, saying, quote, "Catastrophic failure of the concrete dome and instantaneous release of all its contents into the lagoon will not seriously lead to any significant damage or significant change in the radiation dose delivered to the local resident population." In an op-ed printed in the New York Times in December 2014, Michael Gerard, who is the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia, said that the 2013 report by the Department of Energy, the reason for saying that not to worry, is because the radiation inside the dome is dwarfed by the radiation in the sediments in the lagoon. So what's inside the dome is really less than what's on the outside, so don't worry about it. Thus, a leak from the dome would be no added threat because it's dirtier than what's already on the outside. The plutonium isotopes recently discovered in the South China Sea have been traced to the Marshall Islands, some 2,800 miles away. An inspection last year found that the dome was deteriorating. The radioactive groundwater below rises and falls with the tides. Storms wash sand onto the dome, and vines, which we can see, grow in the cracks. So the Compact of Free Association Agreement that was signed between the US and the Marshall Islands in 1983 settled all claims past, present, and future in relation to the nuclear testing. And it also left the Runit Dome under the responsibility of the Marshallese government. So as things stand now, the Runit Dome is likely to be submerged by rising seas or torn apart by storms, releasing its radioactive poison into the ocean and compounding the legacy of our advanced civilization has left to this tiny island nation. As I said, the legacy of the nuclear testing is really hard to describe in words. So I refer you to an award-winning documentary called Nuclear Savage, The Islands of Secret Project 4.1. It's done by an American, Adam Horowitz, and actually Physicians for Global Survival is showing this in Ottawa. If you're going to be in Ottawa on Saturday, let us know, and you can see the film. It's an account of how the Marshall Islanders were used as human guinea pigs for 3 decades to study the effects of the nuclear fallout on human beings. It's based on recently declassified US government documents, survivor testimony, and previously unseen archival footage. Marshall Islands describe the $150 million that they receive for all claims, past, present, and future, as unfair and inadequate. And they have filed claims for in excess of $3 billion with the US. The US, as you would expect, has denied the claims. But the two countries do meet almost farcically, and you can see in the film, they meet on an annual basis to discuss the claims. And the interview or attempted interview with the US ambassador multiple times during the film. So the question of compensation for the testing, In 1986, the US Congress recognized the contributions and sacrifices made by the Marshallese as a result of this nuclear testing program. And actually in some of the footage in this film shows the American ambassador speaking, I can't remember what the particular date is, but she's speaking at a function on the Marshall Islands, and she's thanking the Marshallese for their generosity and the enormous contribution that they have made towards making the world a safer place, basically. So as part of the Compact of Free Association, the $150 million Nuclear Claims Trust Fund was set up as financial settlement for the damages caused by the nuclear testing. The investment returns were projected to be about $18 million annually for a total of $270 million over 15 years. They're to be distributed among the population of the two test sites, Bikini and Eniwetok, and Rongelap and Uthrik, which were the ones that received the downwind fallout from them. And these were for medical and radiological monitoring and also for the payment of claims. So the compact settled and terminated nuclear compensation lawsuits by Marshall Islanders against the US government. And the Nuclear Claims Tribunal it continues to exist, but there is no hope of any future compensation. Although as I say, they continue to meet, so I suppose there is some possibility that there could be future compensation. As I mentioned at the beginning, that the Marshall Islands receives funding from the U.S. for the leasing of land to the U.S. for the missile testing range on Kwajalein Atoll. The U.S. continues to test missiles and anti-missile systems at the Ronald Reagan test site. Having just done so actually in August, they launched a dummy Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, quote, continuing its mission providing strategic deterrence for the United States and our allies. And so the test re-entry vehicle lands in the Kwajalein Atoll. And a very patriotic quote coming from the Air Force Global Strike Commander about how important these missile tests are for those who seek protection from aggression and from our adversaries who threaten our peace. So the Marshall Islands have a relationship, sort of push-pull relationship with the United States, which is interesting to keep in mind in the context of both the lawsuit at the ICJ and the one in the federal court. In terms of environmental concerns, just a word on that, because the Marshall Islands, as a country of low-lying islands, is very subject to climate change and the rising of the seas. They face some very serious challenges and also have, as I mentioned already, have had a number of instances where some of the islands have been totally washed over. In August of 2013, the leaders of the Pacific Islands met at Majuro, which is the capital of the Marshall Islands, and adopted a declaration setting forth commitments to implement national reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and to accelerate efforts to adapt to climate change. A stated aim of the Majuro Declaration is to contribute to the mobilization of the political will for a universal and ambitious and legally binding climate change. So why are these lawsuits so important? Why do they matter? Why should we care, given the David and Goliath, mouse that roared, near Don Quixote-like effort of this small country to take 9 nuclear weapons states to the World Court? Well, the first reason is, apart from Japan, no other nation has a stronger moral claim to call the nuclear-armed states to account than the Marshall Islands do. As I've said, from 1946 to 1958, the U.S. conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests there, all the while reassuring the local people that the tests would, quote, with God's blessing and with God's blessing, result in kindness and benefit to all mankind. At the time of filing the applications in 2014, Foreign Minister Tony de Broom said, "Our people have suffered the catastrophic and irreparable damage of these weapons, and we vow to fight so that no one else on earth will ever experience these atrocities again." Reason number 2, this is the first time in almost 20 years that the International Court of Justice has been asked to address the issues related to nuclear weapons since the 1996 advisory opinion, when it said that there is an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament. Since the NPT came into force in 1970, nearly half a century ago, no other nation or organization has sued for the enforcement of the NPT, which has been basically contemptuously ignored by the nations that possess and continue to upgrade their nuclear weapons. Reason number 3, the Marshall Island lawsuits reflect the grave concern of many nations. The island's legal struggle to bring about nuclear disarmament meshes with what has become known as the humanitarian initiative. International meetings in Norway in 2013, Mexico and Austria in 2014, the latter one in Austria attracting some 159 governments, have examined the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons with the unequivocal conclusion that any use of nuclear weapons would cause human suffering on an unimaginable scale far beyond any capacity for humanitarian response. This movement, the humanitarian movement, has gained momentum in a number of areas. And the NPT Review Conference in 2010 adopted the language decrying the catastrophic human consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. Humanitarian pledge that has been signed by 117 nations so far seeks to fill the legal gap for the stigmatization, prohibition, and elimination of nuclear weapons. These lawsuits contribute to that effort. Reason number 4, there is currently no end in sight for nuclear weapons. This effort is unique in calling the nuclear weapons states to account. The global trend of nuclear weapons has been cut to 15,850. The nuclear weapons states' modernization programs are ensuring that these weapons, which the modernization program, which costs more than $100 billion a year, the US government is planning to spend more than $1 trillion on weapons production infrastructure, ballistic missiles, submarines, and bombers over the next 30 years. So nuclear weapons will be retained for the rest of this century. And it is shocking that 1,800 nuclear weapons remain in a state of high operational alert. The danger of use by accident, design, or terrorism grows daily. As Doug Roach would ask, is there anyone here today who truly believes that terrorists will not one day set off a nuclear device? Reason number 5, the Marshall Islands are drawing much needed attention to nuclear weapons through this initiative. This audacious lawsuit is groundbreaking, a disarmament wedge. Laurie Ashton, who is the lead attorney for the U.S. in the U.S. federal court case, has said, when you sue the nuclear nations, then they listen. It also catches people's attention because of the huge power balance of the Marshall Islands versus 9 nuclear-armed countries. It's an opportunity to raise awareness and to educate people. Reason number 6, the world as we now know it is inhabited is imperiled by both nuclear weapons and climate change. Nuclear disarmament and climate protection are both intrinsically global, political, and legal processes. They involve the implementation of general obligations, the setting of a framework for action contained in international legal agreements, such as the 1968 NPT and the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In both areas, the central question is whether states parties are acting in good faith to meet their obligations. the question is squarely raised by the Marshall Islands case in the International Court of Justice and also by climate change negotiations. For more on the Marshall Islands and climate change, I refer you to a YouTube video of Marshall Islander Kathy Jetnell-Kijiner, who performed at the United Nations in 2014. Has anybody seen that video? Yeah. She's a young mother who responded with a rap poem and was selected to come to speak at the UN Climate Leaders Summit. It was just exactly a year ago in late September. So through poetry and rap, she tells the world about the impact of climate change on the Marshall Islands and the whole region of Oceania, but also about the perseverance and the resilience of the Marshallese people. It's just Google UN Climate Summit Marshall Islands. You can find it. It's about 6 minutes or so, and she's really quite amazing. It's a hyphenated name. It's Jetnil. And the second part is Kijiner. The 2014 UN Climate Leaders Summit. So she says of her people, one of the lines of the poem is that we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. So what can you do to support the Marshall Islands? The amicus curiae is a Latin term for the friend of the court, and I referred to the one that's been submitted by the International Physicians and for Prevention of Nuclear War and Pax Christi. This was submitted to the US case in the federal court, but they can also be submitted to the ICJ. So you require a lawyer, and there's a lot of legalese in it, but it is possible to make a statement directly to the court. There's also a number of letters of support that have been received from Canadian organizations. And if you want to know whether the organization that you're part of has indicated its support for the lawsuits that would go through the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, please let me know afterwards. I give you the names of the groups. The nuclearzero.org is the website of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation about the Marshall Islands case, and there's a lot of good information there about the cases themselves, about the testing, and about the Marshall Islands. I recommend the documentary Nuclear Savage, Project 4.1. PGS, as I said, has it in Ottawa. It's available through the producer and director in the States. Depending on what you want to use it for, there is a cost. But it is quite a useful film to spark discussion as well. And educate yourself. Get the story out. Write about it, blog about it, tweet, whatever. But it is quite an amazing story, which, as Barbara said at the beginning, is not well known. But there have been fairly significant articles in The Guardian and the New York Times, Boston Globe, a number of big US papers. Not so much in the Canadian papers, but there's no reason why we couldn't have one there as well. So in closing, I would just like to quote again from another Marshallese. In 1982, the people of Kwajalein sailed in and took over 11 off-limit islands and lived there for 4 months. So that's where the US base is located. So by doing this, they effectively shut down the US base and stopped the testing for a while. Darlene Keju Johnston, who was born on the island of Ibai and grew up on one of the other atolls, she died from breast cancer at 45. But these are her words that, again, in this book, she describes that particular action in 1982. We are only a very few thousand people out there on tiny islands, but we are doing our part to stop this nuclear madness. And although we are few, we have done it. which means that you can do it too, but we need your support. We must come together to save this world for our children and for the future generations to come. Thank you very much.